So when we did the first round of this draft, where people picked the subjects that they wanted to come to the table and talk about, self-control was left empty in round one. So you stepped up for round two and said, I'll talk about self-control. Why in the world would you volunteer for that to be your subject?
Got essentially 2 points to make about self-control. They're seemingly diametrically opposed, and like the good Bible-thumping Christian that I want to be, I'll try to use Bible to support both sides.
Okay, this should be interesting.
Yeah. Should be interesting because I should have pulled up notes earlier. But so first, I want to try to make the point that self-control is awesome. It's fantastic. There's no such thing as too much self-control. Not very Aristotelian of me to say, but yeah, at first I want to make the point that there is no such thing as too much self-control, maybe just self-control not properly used. I think in making that point, the first thing that you got to say is you got to explain that self-control is just as much about doing things as it is about not doing things.
Okay.
Probably more so about doing things, actually. It's self-control is just about mastering the self. And if we want to talk about how important it is and how fantastic it is, there's this game that you can play with. I think it's more oftentimes done with like cardinal sins or just any specific sin, where you take that sin and you blow it up, and you say it's like a really big thing, and it's actually the root of all other sins. And you can play this game starting just about anywhere. Some sins are easier to start with than others, but you can play this game, and you can also play the game with virtues, where you take a virtue and start talking about it, and you say, really, if you could nail this one virtue, it's actually all the other ones too.
Yeah.
So like, oh, you know the game.
Yeah, I've seen
Okay.
this game played.
Could you do some for self-control?
I guess. Yeah, I guess you could do it just like you could for any of them. But to say that self-control, that if you use your framing, that it's as much about what you do as what you don't do, that if you go forward with that, then you could invest all of your best energy in bringing about the others. That you could invest in activities that bear fruit by bringing out the other virtues, and that you could minimize the energy that was going to those things that, shrunk down the negatives.
Yeah, I'd say if you wanted to play the game and arrive more concisely at a few virtues, you could say things like courage. Courage is really just self-control in the face of fear. Or you could say patience is just self-control in dealing with your temper. Or kindness. It's just the self-control to, even if it's coming unnatural, even if it doesn't come naturally to you, kindness is just using self-control to put somebody else's needs above your own.
This is interesting.
Yeah, and I think so. You can easily make these arguments for self-control. You play the game, make it all these other virtues.
Yeah.
And to further emphasize like just how powerful self-control is, a lot of people don't think about it this way, but when you go on if you've ever gone on a run, at some point, for a lot of us immediately, it's unpleasant, right?
That's why most of us don't do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you go on, but imagine that you go on this run. You're going to start breathing hard, and then you're going to want to stop. And it takes self-control to not stop. It takes self-control to keep doing something, not do something. And that self-control is really important. It's really healthy for you. If you want to talk about something a little more important than just going for a run, you could talk about, instances in your career, for instances raising your kids, where You need self-control to do the things that you really know you ought to do. And so self-control is super important to pull in a little bit of Bible. I don't have the notes pulled up at the moment, but there's this part in the Bible where Paul is talking, a lot of parts where Paul is talking, but a specific one where he's talking about the law. And he has this famous line where he says something like, I do what I hate, and I do not do what I love. And that if you bother to read the verses immediately preceding it and immediately following it, he's more talking about the law. But there's also obviously an issue of self-control there. And at the end of that chapter, he says, he makes a point that because he loves the law, he loves God, but he fights against this internal sin nature. But he loses sometimes. He does what he hates and does not do what he loves. And so it's that sin that sins, that makes him sin. And so I think that you can read at least those passages of the Bible and make a claim that the Bible tells us all sin as a Christian. It just comes down to a lack of self-control. So that's my point for self-control being important.
That is fascinating, and I think you've made a very strong case. I'm going to piggyback with you.
Yeah.
You mentioned Aristotle earlier.
Yes.
I've been listening to this thinker who is a big fan of Augustine,
Okay.
based on this Aristotelian thing. And Augustine had this view that we sometimes talk about sin as our body doing harm to our spirit or causing our spirit to veer off in the wrong direction. And in this Augustinian model, it says, actually, no, you've got it wrong. Sin is actually when our spirit misappropriates our body. It's when our spirit's off track and it pulls our body into right temptation. And so when we assign sin to being in the body and harming our spirit, we're exactly wrong. That the self-control actually comes from our spirit, which makes sense because that's where God's spirit is at work, right? And then it bears the fruit of having self-control in our bodily desires to not allow our spirit to mislead our body. I think that's a fascinating switcherooski.
Yeah. I think
That's a theological term, by the way. Yeah.
Whenever we bring up sin, it's really common to think about, I'm forgetting the fancy words for that, but it's really common to think about sin as being earthly, bodily, and then the spirit as being different.
Yeah.
And the sin comes from just the fact of corporeal existence.
Yeah.
But here my argument about sin is more that our spirits are so weak, and it's not just a physical thing. It's we say we think we want to do something, and other stuff comes along, and our self-control breaks. We give in, and that's, I don't know if I'd really plant a flag here, but the argument I put forth is that is what the sin is. So and it leads to, if you believe that, it leads to this idea that sin is actually just a weakness in the face of external influences. But that we could talk about what I think sin is, what you think sin is, what anybody thinks sin is for a long time. I think the second point that I would want to make, unless you want to stay here.
No, I want to hear your second point. I want to hear your second point.
My second point would be that self-control is actually worthless, and it's no good. It doesn't matter at all. So
All right, I did not see that coming.
I wondered.
Walk me through that. Walk us through that.
Well, I'll try to meander a little less and be more concise with this one, which is, I think, actually easier to do. Um, there have been brief, very brief periods where I've actually been really good at the self-control thing.
Okay.
I remember when I was in college, there was a time where Heather was away in New Orleans studying for a master's degree, and my closest friend at that time was also away. He was studying abroad in Spain, and so I was just trying to hammer away at school, and I put together this schedule. I was super disciplined, which sometimes I managed to pull off in bouts. And so I had this schedule that had me exactly where I should be, to the level of a half hour every day, 24 hours a day.
Whoa.
And I managed to stick with it for a whole week. It felt so good. I got so much done. I was like,
Awesome.
self-control. I am nailing it. I've got this. And I really did it for a whole week. And then I kept doing it. And by about a week and a half, I just had such a feeling of apathy to the world and my life, and felt dead inside, and loved Ecclesiastes way too much. And I've talked to some of my other friends who have tried things like this, gotten really into like, here's my plan. I'm really just going to be all about discipline. Really taking the part where in the Bible where Paul talks about training your body like an athlete. Like they compete by the rules to win the prize.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a model for the Christian life. And so you got to train yourself. You got to make, as Paul would say, you got to make yourself a slave to the law. And so I've talked to friends who've tried this, and I've tried this, and even if you succeed, however briefly, for me at least, maybe it's because I've got a weaker will than I'd like, but even if you succeed, you just start to feel drained and apathetic. And it's just like you're just going through routines. That's pretty miserable. Which you would think shouldn't happen because you're doing exactly what you wanted to do. And you're like, at least for this week and a half period, I'm fooling myself into thinking I'm doing everything right. Just doesn't feel good. And I think that's because, well, maybe actually self-control is worth absolutely nothing. To us, a swimming pool full of $100 bills, that'd be worth a lot, right? But to God, that's worth nothing. When Jesus went to the cross, he had that prayer in Gethsemane about he wasn't thirsty, he really didn't want to drink from the cup or whatever, right? He said, not my will, but your will be done. Not his will, not about self-control, but about God's will. And that's kind of the ultimate example. I think I would still love to have a lot of self-control. It'd be it'd be really good to have that. That's key to kind of earthly success. But really, what's going to count is if you follow God's will, and it's about offering control up to God. I'll finish the point by talking about this is a really interesting story about a guy named Polycarp. He was, I'm sure you've heard it. He was supposedly discipled by John, the one who wrote Revelation, if that wasn't the same one. And he was a Christian from childhood, but eventually the Roman Empire decided to persecute him. And so at 86, he was taken in to be burned at the stake. And people believe he really did live. We've got two letters that he wrote And so he really did live. And supposedly, when he got taken to be burned at the stake and they were going to nail his hands, he said, no need, don't nail him. The God that I serve will give me the willpower to just stay here in the fire and preach the gospel to you guys, even though I'm about to be burned at the stake. He said it old-timey language,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
but he said, yeah,
Huh.
don't bother, I don't need the nails. God will give me the strength to stand here. And I've never been burned alive myself, but I don't know if a human being has the willpower, has the self-control to really make good on that, to just stand there while they were burned alive. I feel like that could have only come from like somehow actually successfully giving all control up to God. That's crazy.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about. It's going to be a very interesting week of conversation around here. Don't try this at home. So can we thank Caleb for coming to the table? Thank you for doing this. Appreciate it.